Okay, everyone. So with this section, we're going to be talking about how we actually have a chance to study the human brain in living subjects. In the past, for a doctor or a researcher or a psychologist to look at a brain, they had to wait for that person to die. They couldn't safely go in and look at the brain um, while the person was alive, typically because it was really invasive. And then also, if you're just looking at the physical structure of the outside of the brain, you're not going to see a whole lot. You can't really poke around in someone's brain very easily. So, the field of biopsychology is really important, and we study how the biological processes, especially that of the nervous system, relate to the behavior of that individual. And we can do this with a variety of different techniques, and we can investigate areas of the brain that control our mental and behavioral functioning. Importantly, we can learn where these things are localized. So, where on the brain structure or within the brain structure are we seeing these different patterns? And then, how areas are connected to one another in order to facilitate processing. So, we're going to talk about some of the different methods that we use. So, one of the most basic ones is a CT scan. That stands for computed tomographic scan. What they're doing is they're actually taking x rays at a bunch of different angles. So essentially, like they're slicing, like making slice pictures of the brain, and then in a computer, they can put that image together to create a more 3D structure. Um, and we can, when they're looking at this, we can reveal some of the internal brain structures. So we can look at location of strokes, injuries, tumors, and other disorders. So if you look at the picture on the right, you can actually see like a tumor show up, and it shows up like a bright white on the X-ray. The downside to this, even though it's relatively inexpensive compared to a lot of other scans, and the equipment's not quite as expensive, because it is an X-ray, the patients are being given doses of radioactivity, and especially if a person has to have multiple CT scans or if the person is pregnant, it can cause problems. So typically they won't do a CT scan on someone who's pregnant because it can harm the developing fetus. But a person who has multiple CT scans could be at risk for problems with all that radiation. So it's something that is typically avoided if they have to do multiple different scans. MRIs. Oh, I was going to say, we actually have a micro CT scanner at our imaging lab down the hall. So a CT scan works really well for a big subject, so something that's a couple inches, several feet, like your body. Like your brain, is relatively large. It's like a big grapefruit kind of size, or a head of cauliflower. But things that are really small, if you're doing millimeter slices, then you can't really get enough detail. So that's why it's important when we have micro CT scanning, they can actually get much finer slices. We can get a much better detailed image with the micro CT scanner. So we actually have one of those down the hall, so it's pretty cool. MRIs, you've probably seen these on different doctor shows and stuff. What that stands for is a magnetic resonance imaging scan. The body is placed inside a really strong magnetic field, so the person can't have any sort of metal on or in their body. So that's magnetic. So if they have something inside them, like a steel plate or something, if that's magnetic, that can actually get ripped out of their body. Any piercings and things like that have to come out beforehand. But the really cool thing is that this magnet travels around them and it slightly moves the water molecules in the brain, and that allows the camera to see the different structures of the brain. And it creates a 3D image of the brain or the part of the body, and then these slices can be displayed in really fine detail for the doctors to look at. These are a little bit less common because they're really expensive, but they do show a little bit more detail than a CT scan would. fMRI stands for functional MRI. What they do is they use the MRI technology to make activity within the brain, so not just the structures, but the actual activity of different neurons visible. So the really cool thing is that you can see how people process information. So one of the things that's being explored right now is trying to see if we can detect when someone's lying. So if you're telling the truth, you're just kind of replaying memories. If you're lying, you're having to use different cognitive processes to kind of fabricate that new story and make it plausible. But then the question is, should we use that in courts for testimony? So could neuroscientists actually ask people these questions in an MRI and use their brain scans during testimony to show if they're lying. It's like a better polygraph test. We're not there quite yet, and I'm curious to hear what you guys think about that. So here's an image that would come out of an fMRI scan. So here you can see different tracks of neurons and how they're connected to the outside brain structures. You can kind of see on the outside, the little gray area, the MRI image, but then the fMRI image shows the connectivity between different brain regions. So that's really cool. They actually do this at FAU, and a couple of my friends have had fMRI scans of their brain, so they actually have an image of their brain's anatomical structure, which is pretty cool. I'd like to have that done. PET scan stands for positron emission tomography. So what that does is it detects the positrons, which are subatomic particles that are emitted by glucose, which is weakly radioactive. So sugar, as it gets consumed by your brain. So of course you have your blood going through your body that contains sugar. These sugar molecules have a little bit of radioactivity, and that gets detected by the tomography scan. It can show what areas of the brain are using more energy during different types of activities. The higher the energy use, the higher the activity of that region. And so we actually can see a moving color video of the different changes in brain activity as a person is doing an activity. So we could see what you're watch what your brain does when you hear something, when you see something, or when you're speaking. So that's what this is right here. So if a person is looking at something, you see the back of their brain, which is their occipital lobe, which has to do with vision. We'll be talking about all this shortly. Back of the brain has the vision area. Hearing is right in the kind of middle of the brain, right behind your ears. Speaking is a little bit further up from there into the front, and then thinking is kind of all over. You're using different parts of the brain to think about these things. So you can actually see this as it changes live on the screen in pretty close to real time type scan. So it's really, really an impressive scan. We can also see changes in activity based on different cognitive impairments. So the normal brain is on the left, the mild cognitive impairment in the middle, and then someone with Alzheimer's disease whose brain has begun to degrade with the disease, you actually see that center part getting much larger, and the cortex, the outside part of the brain, much thinner. So we can do some different clinical studies of the brain. So electrical stimulation can be done. They'll use this is actually when they actually can go into the person's brain. So like during the surgery, they can use an electrode, which is a thin wire, and they can essentially touch the surface of the brain and turn on that small region. So they can see the effects of stimulation. So during brain surgery, a person's awake. If you've listened to the podcast, Blame, you've kind of heard about this already. The person's awake. Obviously, their head is numb, so they can't feel what's going on. But the brain itself doesn't have any pain receptors, so you can touch the person's brain with them awake, and they're not going to feel anything. What they do is they take this little electrical current, and they kind of tap the brain in different parts to see what happens. Sometimes they may feel something. They may feel a tickle. They may remember something. They may hear a song. So these different memories can be pulled up and be activated. And so if you're trying to avoid certain structures and trying to target removing, say, a tumor, then you want to make sure you're only going to remove the tumor and not the brain tissue. They can actually do this with electrodes to kind of find the margin. You can also do what's called ablation, which is removal of parts of the brain. So they might remove tissue of the brain to stop to remove the area where a seizure emanates, or again, tumor type tissue. So you can actually see the changes in the person's behavior afterwards. So ablation is actually like the removal of this section. And then deep lesioning is when they go underneath the surface and they can remove different parts. Now the brain is really soft. So oftentimes they just use suction to kind of like suck out the part of the brain that they're trying to remove. Excuse me. So it's kind of cool how many surgical techniques they can do even within the brain. We can also do EEGs, or electroencephalography. They measure the waves of electrical activity produced near the surface of the brain. This is actually something that's pretty inexpensive, say $100,000 to $200,000 for the equipment. these like electrode caps, kind of like nets, go over the person's scalp, and they're placed as close to the scalp as possible through the person's hair. Typically, they use either a gel or water to increase the conductivity. And then these electrodes, they're all numbered, and so they relate to different positions on the head, whether it's like dead in the top, center, or on the sides. And then they measure the electrical current, and that's displayed on a screen. And you can see each of these different electrodes picking up the current of the brain. So if the person is, say, having a seizure, you can actually see this like wave of activity, this like lightning bolt of activity occurring in different parts of the brain. So we can detect tumors, epilepsy, and other diseases. And you can also see different patterns of activity during different activities that the person's doing. So sleeping, daydreaming, hypnosis, other mental states like under the influence of drugs, you can actually see those changes even on the surface of the brain. We'll talk more about those in chapter 5. But here's kind of an example of different types of brain waves that you can see. So if a person's excited, we have a lot of what they call beta waves, these really short, choppy waves. When you're relaxed, we have alpha waves. They're longer, slower. When you're drowsy, you're kind of in between. These are theta waves. When someone's asleep, they go through like activities of slow or periods of slow activity, and then a really sharp, fast activity, which is called a sleep spindle. And then really deep sleep, this long, slow waves and kind of irregular shape. Those are delta waves. And this is kind of what the cap looks like. So you can see they have to put this over the person's head. Her hair is pretty wet. And they're trying to get the electrodes pretty close to the surface of the scalp. And then each of these has a number on it. And then they will pick up the activity. So like the one that's kind of like just on her hairline right in the middle of the picture, it looks like it's number 7 or 2 or something. They can see on the screen the activity that's happening in that region of the brain. I actually had an opportunity to do this when I was at Ohio State. Our lab had an EEG system, and they were practicing with it. So they were practicing putting it on different adults and different children. I will say it's rather uncomfortable because it has to be quite snug on your face. But it's pretty cool. The stimuli they showed me was just like, it's like circle, 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 circle on the screen like 30 times. And they're recording my brain's activity as I viewed this circle. And now your brain's not just looking at a circle, thinking circle. It might be hearing people down the hall, thinking about homework, thinking about like what I want to eat for lunch. So your brain's doing a whole bunch of other activity, but it's kind of getting the average of all of that. And then they would show like little ducky, and it was like, oh, look at that, something new. And your brain like spikes in activity, and you can see these changes over time. So depending on what they're trying to do, they can actually measure a whole variety of different types of responses of the brain, which is pretty cool. And they can do this with infants all the way up to adults. It's a very flexible technology. So we're studying the brain. Here's our different technologies on the left, the different types of procedures, and then the different types of questions that can be answered by these different technologies. So EEGs, you could look at the person's state of arousal, so how awake or how excited they are. With PET scans, you could look at the different parts of the brain that are active during different tasks. fMRI, we can see kind of the same thing, but also specific regions or tracks between areas of the brain that will be active during this process. You know, PET scans are nice because it's more diffuse. You're going to get a larger area. fMRI might be a little bit more specific, but probably not as good as far as time. So you might be a little more lag with that. All right, so that's the end of this section. Thank you very much. Next time we're going to be talking about the brain itself finally.